Hi, this is the Manchurian Joe, and if you hear any background noises, please ignore them. I can't really do much about that. Otherwise, I would have to record another day, and it's almost through the weekend. I want to get this video out as fast as I can. So today, we're going to be talking about cheap weapons. Not necessarily the most cheap, just 5 cheap weapons if you need to arm a law militiamen or levies in the medieval period. Now, today we're going to start... The first weapon we're going to start off is the spear. I know this is not a spear, but just imagine this with a spearhead. So, it's the oldest weapon humanity has to offer, pretty much. It's one of the oldest. And if you need to hold the enemy at bay with a bunch of guys, and you want to make it as cheap as possible, get yourself a bunch of spears. They'll do the trick. Whether it's a one-handed spear or a two-hand spear, not a pike, because that's a different weapon. That's a different weapon, even though they work similarly with each other, or no, they're related to each other. But no, the pike is a different beast. So spears are really good at just keeping the enemy out, and you can do a lot with a spear. Well, I say a lot, but you can move fast with a spear, and it'll be easy enough to hold off any opposing enemies with the spear compared to something like an axe or a sword or just most weapons aside from other polearms. So next weapon we're going to talk about is the axe. The axe is the in-between of a mace, just full-on bludgeoning weapons, and swords. Actually, no, just swords. We're just gonna roll with that. And it's in the one-handed category. So the axe is quite useful because it has a lot of chopping power and percussive force. It's why I say it's the in-between between those two categories of sword and bludgeon. You pretty much get best of both worlds. Granted, it's not as effective as the maces, the bludgeons, and not as effective at cutting than the sword. It's not as good as cutting and thrusting as like the sword, but it's a decent like middle ground. And pair it up with a shield, you got yourself a pretty good setup right there. Assuming you have the other kit, a helmet, or at least some sort of head garment, like a coif. Coif works pretty well, decently enough. It's a standalone armor. Especially against blunt impact force. It's better than taking a hammer straight to your skull or a sword blade to the skull. Might as well have some layers trying to stop it as much as it can. So, but in general, an axe and a shield are pretty good combo, and the axe itself is pretty damn cheap as well. Pretty much every weapon on this list is cheap, because they don't need as much material as other weapons. The axe, you can't, well, depending on how much material or how big the axe head is, or how thin the axe is, the amount of material you need to forge it will vary. But in overall, it's still pretty damn cheap compared to stuff like swords and more elaborate polearm forms or more refined polearm forms. Alright, next weapon, we're going to talk about the spiked club, which is the lesser version and the more brutish version of the mace, which we'll also be talking about here. Actually, I'll just talk about both, the spiked mace and the regular mace, or spiked club and mace, you get what I mean. The spiked mace is just a stick, like a decent sized stick with spikes coming through it. Hence the spiked club, because it's less heavy than a mace, comparatively, but it has more. It's more gnarly. I'll say that, but that doesn't necessarily equate to cheapness. The cheapness comes into the things you're actually striking with, because a stick by itself is already cheap enough. If you just jam in a bunch of spikes, it's more cost effective than, say, putting up a whole mace head. Now that of course that depends on how big the mace head is, or what time period you're talking about overall. But the spiked mace, you don't really need a lot of material. You just need a bunch of spikes to jam it into the club, and boom, you get yourself a spiked mace. The other one, though, and also another thing, it also depends on how big the spikes are in general. If it's very small spikes, then yeah, it's gonna be even more cheap. If it's like decently long spikes, it's gonna take more material, but overall, it's still comparatively cheaper than a lot of other weapons. Then now it's time for the mace. The mace is pretty much the same thing, except take out the spikes, and you have a head, like a mace head. Now the mace heads comes in different forms. You can have a flange mace. Because some maces, I would assume, would have like a flanged head, but not necessarily like a metal shaft like later flange maces though. So if you get like a wooden half and you attach a flanged mace head to it, that'll work pretty well. It doesn't take as much material. It's a little bit more costly to make, but if you want to go like cheaper, you can just get like a round head, a round mace head, and just attach that to the shaft. It doesn't even need to be that big. It just needs to be big enough that you can inflict some damage with it. You'll find out like earlier with earlier maces that have like small mace heads, and that's pretty damn cheap. It also depends on what material it is. You got iron, mild steel, brass, bronze. Depending on the material, it can be even more cheaper than the other materials and the amount you use. Now, that's 4 weapons. The last weapon we're going to talk about is the flail. And luckily, I have an example I can show off. Just give me a bit. You can get yourself one of these. The flail is quite the formidable weapon, and it's also a cheap weapon too. Depending on what configuration it is, if it's like 2 sticks bound by rope, that's pretty damn cheap. That's like the cheapest you can get. If you add some bits of metal in it, yeah, it'll get more expensive, but relatively it's less expensive than other weapons. It's a rather cheap weapon overall. And it's easily replaceable, like all the other weapons on this list. They're all pretty much replaceable in their own ways. With this, you just have to replace the chain or the rope or whatever you're using, a head or the shafts. But overall, flails, axes, spiked clubs, maces, and spears are among the cheapest weapons you can use to form up, just to equip an entire militia. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you for watching my video. I will update. Uploads are gonna be coming out. I'm changing it up into once a month, just so I don't. Reason being, I don't want to run out of ideas too fast. And if I do it like every other week, if I do videos every week, I'm gonna run out of ideas eventually. So I'm gonna just change it to once a month, and it'll be in the middle of the month, like around like this time of the month, because it is technically the middle of the month. So every 3rd week of every month, I will drop a new video until unless something happens or I ran out of ideas. But yeah, that's about it. See y'all another time. Peace out.